disrupt their activities. And even though the FBI can't prove somebody inside the FBI is a spy, well, the easiest way to disrupt them is to get them out of the FBI, and that way, if they're a spy, we just saved ourselves, and if they aren't, tough luck.
I think you got into that a little bit just now, but I mean, how does the Bureau's lack of diversity affect the way that it approaches its mission?
Well, I think for any law enforcement agency to not be representative of the communities it polices, that creates a problem, and a knowledge gap. I mean, part of it is that it's easy to look at suspiciously at somebody who might be engaging in very normal behavior for that community. And when the FBI has the powerful tools that it has, it can do real damages before it determines this was all much ado about nothing. So having a diverse workforce, I think, is essential to the effective management of a law enforcement agency. But more so where what we've seen, and some of the case studies I talk about in the book, it involve activities that maybe start out with a justifiable purpose, but then go on long beyond when it's appropriate, or expand to so many people that it should be obvious on its face that it's an abusive investigation. And it really takes somebody in the agency, number one, having robust guidelines so they can point to a rule that says you can't do this, but second, having the courage to stand up and say, I know this community, I know what's going on here, I know what you're doing, you need to stop this. And I talk about a number of courageous agents who make that stand, and unfortunately to the detriment of their own careers.
You say something in the book that I think is really interesting and I think relevant, particularly relevant to the case that you're making, but can you describe how the quote-unquote loopholes in Bureau rules against racial and religious profiling quote, swallow the rules themselves?
Sure. So, because of a lot of good work that many civil rights groups were doing in the 1990s, there was a lot of research about racial profiling showing that it was an ineffective technique, that even if you put aside the discrimination involved and the negative impact it was having on the communities that were targeted, it was simply ineffective law enforcement. It was a bad way of going about the job, and they did a good job of educating law enforcement about that. And I was proud to be in the FBI when we were part of the vanguard of that law enforcement instruction, but it became clear that we needed to have strong federal guidelines. So Attorney General John Ashcroft and President Bush said that they were interested in putting this together, and eventually did, except that 9/11 intervened. So there was a big cutout for national security and border integrity cases. So basically, the message that was being sent to law enforcement is, this is a bad technique, it doesn't work, it alienates communities, but we, the federal government, are going to keep it for our most important investigations. And so what law enforcement learned from that, wink, wink, okay, I hear what you're saying, that's all political correctness. What you're really telling us is that it's very effective because you use it in your most important investigations. So I felt it was the loophole that swallowed the rule. And then in 2014, they were modified again. And in the meantime, the FBI, because it had this wide loophole, had actually implemented a racial and ethnic mapping program across the United States. So the FBI was using census data to map all American communities by race and ethnicity and track what they called ethnic behaviors. At the ACLU, we tried to use FOIA to get what these ethnic behaviors were, and unfortunately the courts wouldn't let us have them. And ethnic facilities. I'm not really sure exactly what that is either. But, very clear, obvious racial profiling. The FBI wasn't drawing these maps because they liked pretty pictures. They were drawing the maps because they were going to treat people on one side of the line differently from people on the other side of that line. And in 2014, when the Obama administration modified the Ashcroft racial profiling guidelines, they actually authorized this racial and ethnic mapping program. So again, it's sending the exact wrong message to law enforcement about the use of racial profiling.
Ethnic activities is really going to stay with me for a while. You write that there are systemic problems at the FBI that, left unchecked, make the Bureau a threat to the very democracy it is intended to serve. That's a heavy statement. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that?
Sure. I think first and foremost, we have to have confidence that there is a rule of law that applies to everyone equally to feel secure in our society. And when we see that the law is not applied equally, and we see that in many, again, you know, I joined during the savings and loan crisis where the people responsible for this financial crisis were being held to account. And to see the 2008 financial crisis where very few were held to account, it creates a cynicism in society. When you see the FBI brazenly targeting certain groups, not just Muslim Americans in the aftermath of 9/11, but labeling eco-terrorism as the #1 domestic terrorist threat, even though there's not a single homicide related to environmental activism, it became clear that your political opinion would put you at risk. And so that kind of behavior undermined the rule of law and undermined that confidence, while at the same time, as we talked about, the FBI not being completely honest with Congress, so that branch of government can't operate as effectively as it needs to, and also with the courts, because the FBI was engaging now in intelligence activities that they claimed needed this extra layer of security. They developed what was called parallel construction. So parallel construction is when you use some secret intelligence technique to gather information, and then once you find what you need, you go back and you use legitimate legal tools to collect that very same information you already have, and then present it to the courts as if that was the original way you collected the information, so that the defendant and the judge and the jury would never know that it was actually this other tactic, and so you'd never have the opportunity to challenge the constitutionality of that tactic.
Does America need a new church commission?
Critically, and it's overdue, actually. And it's not just to look at the abuses, because the abuses, people tend to put security and privacy on a balance, that somehow giving up your privacy makes the country more secure. But if you're not a criminal or a terrorist or a spy, the government invading your privacy does nothing to increase security, right? That's just abusive, and it then creates a problem for the government because now they have all this information they don't know what to do with. So that way of looking at it is wrong, and our security is just as vulnerable to a mismanaged FBI as our liberty is. And we have to understand that, and it's become so apparent now where we have $70 billion we give to the intelligence agencies every year to protect us from foreign threats. And somehow the Russian government came in and meddled with our election of the highest office in the land. And whether you believe that influenced the outcome or didn't influence the outcome, it certainly has disrupted our government in a very profound way and has severely undermined public confidence in our government and in the agencies that are supposed to protect the rule of law. So how could an agency, given so many resources, given the authority to spy on all of us as aggressively as it can, isn't able to find the obvious threat that came in? And before that, the financial crisis. In 2004, the FBI's white-collar crime division head started warning about mortgage fraud, and they said this is going to be an enormous problem that's going to risk our economic viability if we don't address it, and asked for more resources. And Congress and the FBI leadership said, no, we're focused on counterterrorism, that's the #1 threat, not realizing that a financial collapse was a national security threat, arguably far greater than anything any terrorist could inflict on us.
So I want to pivot a little bit into the politicization of the Bureau, which I think is another important part of your book. You the Daily Mail published something of a pro-Trump slant on your criticisms of James Comey and Robert Mueller, but can you articulate your criticisms of their stewardship of the Bureau and how they made the systemic problems you describe in the book worse?
So I started the book talking a lot about the immediate aftermath of 9/11, and you might remember Colleen Rowley, who was a colleague of mine at the FBI, an agent in Minneapolis, who ultimately wrote a letter that was made public that laid out a lot of the evidence that, it's hard to go back in time and remember how all that's happened, but the Bush administration was resisting the idea of an independent commission to study the intelligence failure, and information was not coming out, and what we were being presented with from the intelligence community was this was such a diabolical attack. These people attacked without warning. Somehow these operatives were in the United States and able to do all this without associating with any target of the federal government that we knew of, and this shows how diabolical we are, and therefore we need these grander tools, when in fact, everyone in the FBI, especially in Minneapolis, because that's where one of the cases was based, knew that there were cases that the FBI had that were giving some clue that there was something afoot. And